title. Giles Flythe Engineers was founded in 2003. They specialize in working with community associations and property owners in problem solving, repair maintenance planning, pre-purchase due diligence, and cost estimating. They work with hundreds of community associations each year, including large-scale property owner associations, high-rise condominium properties, townhome communities, commercial owner associations, and nonprofit entities. Their services include reserve studies, transition studies, construction administrative consulting, stormwater pond inspections, and engineering consulting. They provide over 200 reserve studies each year for community associations. Tyler has years of experience in structural engineering design of commercial and residential buildings, including new construction and renovation. He has provided construction administration consulting for numerous capital repair projects for townhome and condominium associations, including roof replacements and siding replacements. He is a licensed professional engineer in North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Tennessee. He has also achieved the CAI designation of Reserve Specialist and serves on the Piedmont Council for CAI North Carolina. Following the presentation, we will ask any questions that may have been submitted that weren't addressed, along with the results of our raffle. Without further delay, let's get started. Please sit back and enjoy. I'll turn it over to you, Tyler.
Thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. As she mentioned, my name is Tyler Hall, Giles Flythe Engineers, and I'm the engineering manager for our Charlotte office. We specialize in building and site component evaluation and design. And we use that engineering expertise to assist associations with their maintenance planning through reserve studies. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We'll get started with a quick definition of capital reserves. As many of you on boards are aware that your association dues are made up of generally two components: operating expenses that occur on an annual basis and long-term repairs that generally come out of a reserve account. So a separate account, which is set up by the association to fund non-annual repairs, would be a reserve account. Some refer to it as a long-range fund. These are for items like your major repairs to stormwater ponds, dredging those ponds, or massive drainage improvements, resurfacing asphalt paving, maybe even significant roof replacements if you're a townhome or condo community, or amenity repair and replacement. It's not going to be for your typical operating systems, your landscaping, your maintenance, utility costs, or management fees, etc. It's important to have reserve accounts for those repairs that do not occur on an annual basis, things that aren't included in your annual maintenance budget. It's a fiduciary responsibility for your association to have long-range funding and planning. Some governing documents will require a reserve fund to be established and when the community is formed, and some states require reserve accounts to fulfill statutory requirements. So a question we get asked frequently is, how much money should we be saving? Right? A lot of communities are doing their best to educate a guess at this, but the best answer is certainly going to be a reserve study. So why do you need a reserve study? It answers that question. And if you go to the next slide, Sarah or Nicole. Why do you need a reserve study? It answers the question of how much we should save or prepare for future expenses. Looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties losing screen share.
Nicole's computer just shut down, so give me just a second. I'm going to share my screen so that I can get this back up for you guys. Gotta love technology, you guys. Hang on just a second, okay?
Sure, no problem.
All right, you were on Second slide, you said?
Correct.
Okay.
It's the title, Why a Reserve Study.
Okay. Let's do that. And then there we go. Okay. You can see this, or it's loading. It should be loading.
There we go. Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for hanging in there with us.
Yeah, of course.
So why a reserve study? It answers that question of how much you should be saving to prepare for future expenses. It can certainly help avoid special assessments. I won't say in every case that a reserve study will not include special assessments. That's certainly going to depend on previous funding. But it's certainly a really good budgeting tool which allows HOAs to possibly invest their reserve funds effectively. A good reserve study should also be a maintenance guideline. It should be letting you know when to anticipate significant repairs and how much they're going to cost. Certainly, a reserve study should fulfill any local government requirements, lender requirements if you need to get a loan for some reasons, and certainly any statutory guidelines. The next slide, continuing, what is a reserve study? It is an estimate for the HOA's future capital expenses. In a nutshell, it's a financial analysis. It's going to include items like roof replacements, exterior building maintenance, significant repairs or painting the full buildings, likely road maintenance if you have private roads in your communities, and things of those natures. It's going to include cost and time estimates for when repairs are going to be needed over the next 20 years is a typical term for a reserve study. A key component is going to provide a general evaluation of the condition of the association's assets. So when we come out to do a reserve study, there's a site inspection included. It's going to provide condition of your stormwater retention systems. Do they appear to be functioning adequately? Is your paving deteriorating at a typical rate or sooner than anticipated? It's going to be a high-level overview of all the components that the association is responsible to maintain, including any amenities, tennis courts, pools, fitness centers, and clubhouses, etc. A reserve study, again, at its core, is a financial analysis. Moving on to the next slide, of the HOA's reserve funds and their current reserve contribution rate. So most communities are currently putting something away in the reserve account, and it's going to include a current reserve account balance, a contribution rate as part of a financial analysis. We need to go back one slide. A reserve study is going to adjust for inflation and average rates of return on invested funds, and it's going to include estimates for year-end balances in a reserve fund.
It's still too far in advance.
It's too far in advance.
It doesn't, let me tell you, this thing is.
Would you like me to share one of my screens?
Yeah, let's see. Okay.
One more.
Right here? Or this one?
I had one. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay. There we go. We will get it down.
Yeah, we'll get there. Thank you.
Technical difficulties.
That's okay. Yeah. So a reserve study is going to have estimates for your end of year balance for each year over the term of that study. And it's going to provide recommended alternatives to make sure that your reserve account is going to maintain not only positive balance, but adequate cash flow over that term. It's going to certainly include maintenance guidelines, suggestions on preventative maintenance, a schedule of these non-annual maintenance repair items. It's going to be included here. We can go on to the next slide.
So we do, I know we're going to obviously hold off questions toward the end. And I see see Bob has his hand raised. So Bob,
Sure.
if you can type your question in the chat for me, that way, one, it's recorded. We can create like an FAQ page afterwards, but then also others can hear it. So Bob, if you have the ability to go ahead and type your question in the chat for everybody, and we'll get to those here in just a little bit.
Perfect. Great. So moving on to that next slide, we're going to see a typical reserve study expense estimate sheet. Yeah,
finally on this stage.
So in our reserve studies, this is a starting point for the reserve financial analysis. This is how we input our data. Along the left of the spreadsheet, you have your capital items with a brief description of the item that we are looking at. It's going to have a quantity of each of those items, as well as unit costs and the cost per cycle. Cycle meaning estimated useful life. Everything that you own in the community has a time where it's going to need repair or replacement. We call that an estimated useful life. And some you'll hear that abbreviated as EUL. Also going to have the condition assessment part, which is the next column, estimated remaining year's life. We won't go through all of these, but for example, resurfacing asphalt paving. If you have private streets or a parking lot in your community, you're going to have a quantity in this one of 7,400 square yards. That unit cost was $21 a square yard back when this reserve study was completed. I can tell you that's not the current cost of asphalt paving. I wish it was. An estimated useful life of 20 years is very common for asphalt paving, as long as it's seal coated correctly and crack filled. And this community was a relatively new community and had a remaining year's life of 19 years. All right. So this is a standard kind of outline of what a reserve study expense estimate sheet would look like. We then take that, looking at the next page, and extrapolate that over the term of the study. We'll break that out. Here's showing 10 years, the next 10 years for this study. Again, the same items along the left. Each year is going to have its anticipated expenditure for that line item. So this is kind of that roadmap of maintenance we were talking about. This is a 10-year snapshot of the items in your community, when they're going to be needing maintenance, and how much that's going to cost. The reserve study is certainly going to include inflation as well. You'll see along the bottom of this sheet here, the total includes inflation for any given year. Now, inflation is certainly an assumption. We can't predict inflation adequately perfectly. We do a pretty good job at that, but certainly some items are going to inflate more than others. We use an average, a historical national average for inflation, which right now is about 3.5%. Let's go on to the next slide. So we take that information and that data and run a funding analysis. Where do your current reserve funds meet this demand for future expenses? So we'll take your starting balance of your reserve fund, your annual contribution rate, and extrapolate that over 20 years. In this spreadsheet, you'll see that we're assuming that the reserve contribution rate does not increase. That's a fairly conservative estimate, right? Certainly things are going to go up, and price and dues will increase over 20-year period, at least for cost of living. But you can see in this community, they were fairly smooth sailing, hovering above positive until the near end of the term. A reason, this was a new community. So they had their roof replacements and their asphalt paving all come in the last 3 to 4 years of the study. The time to be preparing for that is the 20 years prior to needing it, right? So what happens when you hit that zero mark and you're not there? You don't have those funds. You could defer the maintenance. You could potentially apply for loans to offset that balance and pay it back over time. But the best case scenario would certainly be to plan ahead and let's adjust those funding alternatives now so that we don't have to pay so much at the end of the term of the study. So moving on to the next slide, our reserve study is going to include a funding alternative. For this scenario to work out, we certainly need to save more money in the first 10 years than they were anticipating saving, right? So this is based on that roadmap of maintenance, that annual expense projection, and assumed inflation, and your new funding balance. This would be our recommendation for a funding analysis. So if you've had a reserve study done before and you are sitting down for your annual budget meeting, which are probably coming up for some of you guys, you would open up your reserve study, you go to the funding alternative, which you chose, go to that year, and in that column that says reserve account contribution, that would be the amount that you need to budget to save for reserves in that given year. A reserve study can also break that out on an average per unit per month basis. That way you know how it affects your dues, right? This is only the reserve portion. It's not your operating budget. So you certainly want to add that in when you're talking about total dues, but this gives you a great idea for what is going to be anticipated over the term of the study.
Awesome. So Tyler, we do have a few questions, and this might be stuff that's coming up soon. One of them is how to prepare and plan for your reserve study. That comes from James Harrison.
Yes.
Is that something you'll go over, or?
Yes, we're going to talk about how a reserve study is completed coming up next, and the process of a reserve study.
Okay.
So we'll get through those slides, and then I'm certainly happy to hang out and answer all the questions that time allows for.
Okay. Yeah, we have a couple more, like where is money being held, encouraging, some of our associations that don't have reserve accounts to start, planning for that and implementing that.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, we'll certainly tackle those. Thank you guys for the questions. Keep typing them in. We'll keep tabbing them, and we'll get to those. So I want to make sure we're not repeating ourselves. That's great. Glad you guys have questions. That's fantastic. So moving on to the next slide, how a reserve study is completed. There's essentially 5 steps. Really, I could boil this down to about 4, but that final one's fairly important as well. So the beginning, let's say you're interested in doing a reserve study. Kind of a pre to this list would be to get an estimate, right? How much is reserve study going to cost? We can certainly provide a proposal for that. Any company that does reserve studies should be able to offer you a proposal on how much it's going to cost and provide their scope of what's included in their study. Okay, so once that study has been approved, we're going to do to gather any information that we can on the community, any historical information, things that's been done in the past, maybe even a list of items that the board would like to see done, right? Some improvements they would like to see done in the next few years. We'll try to help those along with this study, as well as review governing documents or amendments to governing documents to see what exactly the association is responsible to maintain. A very key component for a reserve study is a site inspection. Site inspection is going to be that determination, that evaluation of your current condition in your community. Is it deteriorating at a rate that is common for that material, or does it need to be expedited in repairs? That site inspection, we're also going to measure the amount, the quantity of all your components to incorporate these unit costs. Now, to back up a little bit, reserve studies, there's 3 types of reserve studies. I'm talking about a full reserve study with a site inspection. If you've had a reserve study before, you could go back to the company who did it originally and get it updated. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's also a update with a site inspection and an update without a site inspection, and I'll dive into those. But this is a full reserve study, a full scope. The financial analysis is the step 3. We've talked about that recently, but essentially this is your estimated cost of repairs, determine how often, when and how often these repairs are going to be needed, and compare your estimated expenses to your reserve revenue. And if that does not create positive or adequate cash flow, certainly develop those funding alternatives as part of that financial analysis. Step 4 is very important. I think we do a great job of this here. Developing this draft report. As part of the study, you're going to get a narrative report talking about the condition of your community. as well as the funding alternatives outlined in the narrative. That's also going to include the spreadsheets and the financial analysis, generally in an appendix. But we want to review that with the board. We're going to make sure the board completely understands the reserve study, how to use it, and what went into it, right? We want to make sure and get any comments or feedback from the board of what was included. Is there anything that needs to change? And then once all those comments are addressed, we'll finalize that report and seal it for your use. Moving forward, who should do a reserve study? This person should be familiar with buildings and site improvements. It should be a competent person with construction experience. Typically architects, engineers, sometimes you'll see accountants doing it because it is a financial analysis. Just make sure they have construction cost estimating experience to have an accurate projection of your funds. CAI, Community Associations Institute, is a national organization. They have a reserve specialist designation, generally has the RS after their name and their signatures. And certainly there's DIY options for reserve studies. If your community is fairly small, only has an entrance monument, maybe some landscaping or irrigation, but no ponds, no paving, no buildings to take care of, maybe that's something that you can do yourself. But once you start getting into those significant repairs of needing to know annual or pond maintenance and paving, takes kind of a vast knowledge of these components. So would certainly recommend not doing it yourself. But for those that have that experience, that's certainly an option. So just to clarify the type of reserve studies, we talked about a full reserve study today. We're going to recommend updating any studies on a 3 to 5 year cycle. The reason for that is for those assumptions that are made in reserve studies, you want to capture actual inflation costs, update your expense estimates, as well as take into account what you've actually accomplished in the past years with your previous study. So certainly recommend updating on a 3 to 5 year cycle. That 3 to 5 year cycle would include, I would recommend a site inspection with that. Under 3 years, if you need to update some funding, I doubt you'll need another site inspection, but if you guys just wanted to, add something or take something away from a financial analysis, you could certainly update that study without a site inspection. So with that kind of concludes.
We had a question about that, is I guess the frequency of how often the study should be done for associations, and you suggest 3 to 5 years, give or take, depending on the elements. And
3 to 5 years, depending on how many components that you're responsible for. If you're townhomes or condos, how many do you have, right? How much? I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, but yes, 3 to 5 year cycle is what we typically recommend for updating a reserve study.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we have several questions, and they're awesome questions. These are so good.
Great.
Obviously is how you can prepare and plan, which you went over. You guys are a great resource. So if you guys are interested in knowing more, please reach out to Tyler and his firm. And then also the cost of what a reserve study, a range maybe, and I know it depends on a lot of things. So if you can kind of touch base on kind of cost and the elements that go into getting an estimate for that.
Sure, no problem. So it's certainly going to depend, the fee for a reserve study is going to depend on the community. How big is the community? How many units do you have and what you're responsible for? I would say our average reserve study costs probably around $3,000 to $3,500 per reserve study. But that goes up from, for high-rise condos, to take a little bit more time. If you have tennis courts and pools and 10 detention ponds, that takes a lot more time, a lot more analysis. So we go up from there. If you would like to know what it would cost for your community, it doesn't cost you to get a proposal. Certainly submit that request. We actually have an online request form on our website that you could actually go through and ask for a proposal. Basically asks some details about your community, gives us that information we need to determine what the fee would be for you, and we can get that to you pretty quickly.
Awesome. So we had another question from Bob. He asked, how would a board or an association go about selling this to residents who maybe don't want to pay or put, more money aside or increase dues for things that they may not be around to enjoy or even use in the first place? What kind of big picture would you say is the benefits of having a reserve study done?
Sure. So the biggest benefit for reserve studies, it kind of takes out that guess, right? If you do not have a maintenance plan, you don't know kind of what to anticipate, and you don't know what you don't know. So if you're in a community and you have responsibility of large capital items, roof replacements and paving evaluations, and you feel that you're not sure if your reserve funding is adequate, the way to spin that to your community is that, look, we're trying to avoid unanticipated costs. So we want to hire a professional to come in, review the community, tell us what condition it's in and what it's going to need. It can help stabilize our budgets in the future, right? That's the biggest point for a reserve study.
Awesome. Good point. So it helps with the unexpected cost of big repairs.
Exactly. It takes
yeah.
that unknown and creates a maintenance plan for you for the next 20 years.
Awesome. That's good. So Rob had a question about communities recovering after builders have turned the HOA over and the boards have kept the dues low. How is that something that reserve studies could maybe plan or project to help them recoup from that?
Right, that certainly happens quite frequently. We see that a lot where a newer community came in, the developer wanted to make the dues attractive and set them fairly low. And the reality is they can be low in the early term of a reserve study, but also as you get closer to that 5 and 10 year mark, those larger items are starting to come due. Right, painting of a building, resealing your penetrations, and resurfacing asphalt paving on out in 20 years. So the time to save for those large scale was certainly going to be as you come to it, instead of trying to cram $250,000 of roof replacements into a 5-year savings plan versus a 10 or 20-year savings plan.
Awesome. Very good. Chris Granberry had a question about, are there any government grants for improving communities, such as adding playgrounds or some common space elements for communities, maybe cost saving opportunities, resources out there?
There are actual government grants. Actually, the city of Charlotte, I believe, has some. CAI just did a presentation on that a couple of weeks back, where they brought in some folks from the county to talk about those options. Now, I don't think they're significant, and it's certainly not something that would help pad a reserve account or anything like that. But if it's something that you were looking to do, they do a community improvement like match program, where if a community was going to put, let's say, $5,000 into a beautification landscaping project, right? You could apply for a grant and they can help fund that. Certainly reach out to the local county and city organizations for that. We don't really get involved on that side of it.
Okay, awesome. And then just recap, and I think you said this already, was reserve studies typically kind of project the next 20 years or so. Can you have shorter time period, longer time period done, or is it
our typical is certainly going to
years?
be a 20-year study. And the reason for that is it's not arbitrary. It's that captures the large scale items over the course of your community's life. The main things that are out that far are roof replacements and paving. All those are going to be captured in 20 years. So the first 10 years of a reserve study is certainly going to be the most accurate. Right. Again, we're making assumptions on inflation. If you take a 3.5% inflation rate in 20 years, that cost is going to be astronomical, certainly. But the first 10 years are going to be the most accurate. But the 20-year term is kind of the minimum and standard. Certainly, you could do a 30 or 40-year term, but just as you get out to those end of those large terms, it's just going to be more and more inflation and inadequacy, and it's not going to be as accurate. Yeah.
Kind of like what we're seeing now.
Right. That would be
Yeah.
another reason to update your study, is if you feel the cost is significantly increased since your last one. It's probably
Yeah.
time to update.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ashley Kern, she's actually one of ours. She has a good question. Going back to associations that have no reserve account, helping encourage savings for unknowns, maybe explaining the benefits of an association with no amenities. Should they invest in a reserve study? For instance, a single family home community, no pool, no clubhouse, no playground, no roof replacements, no repair cost, only assets and common areas like the entrance monument. And that's about it. Should they have a reserve study completed, and why?
Honestly, if you have nothing like that to maintain, maybe you don't necessarily need a reserve study. Right? If you only have an entrance monument and some lighting, you can maintain the lighting on an annual basis, right? Replace it as it fails. It's probably not that significant. So for those communities with no amenities and no common areas that have a capital expense, right? If you don't have paving, if it's just an open area, landscaped grass field that you maintain, there's no improvement there. So certainly this is for those communities with large scale improvements.
Okay, awesome. And is there the best, like a time of year that would be best to have a reserve study completed, or is it, anytime, anywhere?
Right,
Maybe
we
before
certainly do
budget
them.
season? Yeah.
Yeah, we certainly do them all year long. We do a lot more of them right close to budget season. That's when people think about it and it starts triggering it. But nothing wrong with, January comes around, you've got a new budget, you've built in the cost of your reserve study into that 2022 budget. Get it early. I recommend that. I mean, because now our turnaround times are a little bit longer because of the demand, right? Back in January through September, we might be able to get that turned around to you sooner. You don't want just the study delivered to you by the time it's ready to fix your budget, right? You want to understand it. So you want to give yourself time, and boards generally meet infrequently or at least sporadically apart. So you want to give yourself time to digest that information and figure out how that's going to affect your budget coming up. So we certainly do them all year round.
We did have a question from Scott as far as, other disciplines or certifications. Tyler is quite certified and he said, is the engineer the best one to figure out the long-term financing? Not your standard engineer, but Tyler's got quite a bit of experience. I know Nicole at the beginning of our recording went over all of your accomplishments and certifications. So if you want to recap and brag on yourself, all your hard work, Tyler, what certifies you to do this?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed professional engineer. There's no specific requirement for that to do a reserve study. What I recommend to you is just having someone do your study that is well-versed in construction and financial analyses. So it falls right into the engineering category. There's several engineers and architects that do those. You certainly want to make sure that you are getting someone experienced in there who's seen this before, knows those components, and knows how they deteriorate, when they need to be replaced, and how much they're going to cost to replace it. That's really the key here. I'm not going to go through the list of things. Certainly reach out to us if you have any other questions on that.
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. Quick question. Are reserve accounts considered an expense or an asset?
Generally, that would be an asset.
An asset. Okay. Where is a good choice for holding reserve funds? Maybe a type of account. I guess what would be your?
Yeah, so you're certainly going to have at minimum a savings account, if you will. Let's refer to it. Most people just call it a reserve account in addition to their operating account, right? It needs to be set separately from your operating so that you're not going to pull from that on an annual basis. Some take it from there and split their reserves into CD accounts so that they can earn that 1.5% for a couple of years. Going back to that annual expense projection, that's going to help you determine how to save it. So looking at your roadmap, that annual expense projection, if you know you are not going to have roof replacements for 10 years, well, you can take all the money up until that and invest it in a CD with a certain term. It kind of helps you set your CD terms. But certainly talk with bankers are going to be the best options to see where they can get you the most return on investment for your savings.
So that kind of goes to the next question somebody just posted was, basically what options do they have with investing their reserve account, maybe stocks or other types of, market accounts?
Right. So most associations are not for profit. So you do have to kind of be careful on what you're investing them in. Also stock options, right? That has a possibility of losing money. So you have that fiduciary responsibility to your association to adequately maintain those funds. Generally, you're going to want something that's FDIC insured, that you're not going to lose that money somewhere. There have been community associations to invest in the stock market. I don't generally recommend that.
Okay. And this is more advice. So just in a little bit of experience too is somebody had this past year, they took over for a previous board who under budgeted for expenses and left too many items that needed to tend to. And as a result, we didn't allocate any money into our reserves.
Mhm.
What is the best way to explain this to residents without blaming anyone? Just looking for ideas. We did have to raise HOA fees, which I'm sure will not go over well, in order to get back on track into being able to build those reserves up. What would be some advice for this board?
Yeah, I think you kind of leave that part out of it. I don't think that you have to explain, what happened. The past is kind of the past. I work with a lot of boards who for 5 to 10 years, they were just priding themselves in not increasing dues. The reality is that dues should be increasing. I mean, cost of living increases for everyone else. The dues should be going up just to even maintain your operating expenses, not just your reserves. So I think just setting that precedent that, look, dues are going to go up. We're going to try to mitigate that. We're going to put a plan together and looking into those options for getting that maintenance plan.
Awesome. Very good. I think that's all the questions that I've caught up to. Is there any other ones left or any final words you want to share, Nicole or Tyler, before we do our winning raffle and thank Tyler for doing this for us today?
While we're waiting on some to come in, I will go ahead and say, Tyler, on behalf of Cedar, we do appreciate that you taking the time out of your evening to talk to us and talk to our board members. It comes at such a critical time for our board members and our managers as we prepare for budget season and get these budgets going. Your knowledge and guidance has been tremendously helpful. I know I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure our board members did as well. And then I've seen a couple questions come through. So let's go ahead and get those before we go ahead and do our raffle.
So just kind of touching base back on, obviously looking into different options for the best return of investment is, money market account. What's kind of the average savings percentage, which I know that varies. CDs at one time were pretty good. They're not the greatest right now.
Right.
But money market accounts, I know I personally have some associations that have their reserves in a money market account, even if their CDs matured. Any other savings account or any other accounts out there that you would?
Not specifically that I can think of off the top of my head. Most just do the safest option with your CDs. They're going to give you a better return for a safe investment.
Right.
But the historical national average for savings is 1.5%. Now I know it's not always 1.5%. That's just the historical national average. But a reserve study can certainly take into account your history as well, right? So we may start a study and say, we're going to assume you earn 1.5%. Certainly keep an eye on that assumption, because if you're not earning 1.5%, that's going to affect the funding alternatives down the line. If you're only earning 0.25% on a typical savings account, then use that in your study.
Awesome. Good point. Do communities ever change their bylaws to include provisions regarding required reserve restrictions on spending reserves are not sufficient? et cetera?
That would be a great question for an attorney. I wish I was an attorney sometimes. But I think the reality is that, HOAs do mend their documents frequently. Certainly you have to run those through attorneys and your current governing documents to see what that process is like. Yeah.
Awesome.
And we did have a question come in to confirm, to be safe, dues should go up every year. Do you agree?
I generally think that dues should be increasing over the term of a study. Does that mean it's going to go up every year? No. I think you pick the best course for your community. If your community likes to see small incremental increases over every year, then use that option. Our funding alternatives can do step functions, right? Every 3 years, we're going to increase it so that you have 3 years of the same reserve due, right?
Right.
And then increase that incrementally every 3 years. So you have to choose what works best for your community. Some communities do prefer special assessments. It's rare, but they're out there. Most want to avoid those because they don't go over very well.
Absolutely. And are you able to do a study on clay tennis courts?
I mean, we can do a reserve study and incorporate the maintenance for that. Yes. Most tennis courts we've seen have been asphalt paved. And certainly look into that if that's something that you guys, if you need.
Sure.
And you service Western North Carolina. You guys do all of you're licensed in North Carolina.
Yes,
So,
all of North Carolina, South Carolina. We have an office in Virginia, and we also service the surrounding states. Yeah.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Good. I think that's all the questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Everybody
All right.
says thank you. Great presentation. Very informative. Super helpful.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
One more came in from Mr. Rob Ward. Do you recommend borrowing funds or a special assessment for more than one project?
We've certainly helped associations with construction projects, and they do not have the reserve fund to cover the entire thing. Generally, it's a combination of both. A special assessment to cover the upfront cost of the loan. Generally, a lender is going to require you to pay some percentage on the front side, and then they'll loan you the rest. So it's certainly a combination of both of those. What I would recommend when you're thinking about borrowing funds is, if that's the only way to do it, make sure that your term does not exceed the useful life of the component you're repairing. And that should go without saying, but communities have. I've seen a bank loan to paint a building and have a 10-year term. In 10 years, the building's going to be painted again. Right. So you want to think about those things when you're talking about borrowing money. Yeah.
And what is your recommended percentage, or anybody's recommended percentage of savings per year or per quarter for reserves?
That's certainly going to depend on the community. What are you maintaining? I can't narrow that down to a 10% number. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. We have communities that have so many things and some that don't have anything. So
yeah, and it depends on how you've saved in the past, right? I mean, what are we starting with? Certainly look at getting a study to get that question answered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.